The wheel gave out 3 miles from the Larkspur crossing, and Ruth Ann Coldwell went down into the mud with it, 40 baskets scattered across the road like something had shaken the earth just to humble her. She did not cry. She had a rule about that. She knelt in the wet with her skirt soaking through and gathered what she could, and a woman passing in a fine buggy slowed just long enough to look and did not stop. If you have ever been looked at like that, like your trouble was a show put on for someone else's comfort, then stay with this one to the end, because it does not end in the mud. Comment the name of your town below. Subscribe if you believe some doors are worth knocking on twice, and let this story tell itself. She had not always sold baskets on the roadside. 3 years before, she had been a wife, and before that, a girl who watched her grandmother's hands move willow through willow until the strips remembered the shape they were told to hold. Her husband, Daniel, had been a quiet man who broke his back on land that was never quite theirs, and one winter fever had taken him inside of 9 days, and Ruth Ann had buried him with her own hands because the ground was too frozen for the town to spare more than 2 men to help her dig. She had a rule. After that, never cry in front of others. Never ask for more than the minimum. Always give the credit away. Because a woman with nothing left could still afford to be generous with words, even if she could afford nothing else. She wove baskets because her grandmother had taught her, and because Willow did not ask questions, and because a basket once made could feed her for a week if she sold it right and did not eat much in between. The rancher's spread sat at the far end of the valley, past the church and past the mill. A low white house with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a barn that had clearly once been painted red and now wore only the memory of it. She almost did not go that far. Her wheel was fixed with wire and prayer, and every mile past the crossing was a mile she would have to walk back if her luck did not hold. But the sky had that flat, gray look that meant rain by nightfall, and she had 11 baskets left, and 11 baskets unsold meant a week with nothing in the pot but water, and whatever the garden had not yet given up for winter. So she walked the last mile, and she knocked. The door was opened by a girl of perhaps 12, thin as a fence post, with flour on her hands, and an expression far older than her face had any right to wear. Behind her, Ruth Ann could hear a baby crying, not the fresh, outraged cry of hunger, but the tired, ongoing cry of a child who had learned that crying rarely brought anyone running anymore. "Pa's not buying anything," the girl said, before Ruth Ann had said a word. "We got no money for baskets." She began to close the door. "I'm not selling to your pa," Ruth Ann said. "I'm selling to whoever answers. That's you. Today." It was such a plain thing to say that the girl stopped, hand still on the door, and something in her face cracked open half an inch, the way a held breath finally lets go. "I'm Sarah," the girl said, like she hadn't meant to. "I do the cooking, now." Ruth Ann looked at her, really looked, and said, "That's a heavy thing for hands as young as yours." Sarah did not answer that. She only opened the door wider. The house smelled of burnt biscuits and boiled potatoes, and underneath it, something that might once have been a woman's perfume faded into the wood the way grief does, into the grain of a house. Impossible to scrub out. A boy of 9 sat at the table, with his arms crossed hard enough to leave marks, and did not look up. A little girl of 6 sat beneath the table itself, not at it, drawing something on a slate with a piece of chalk worn down to a nub, and did not look up either, though her chalk stopped moving the moment Ruth Ann stepped inside. And in a basket by the cold hearth, an old basket badly made coming apart at the rim, an infant cried the tired cry that had followed Ruth Ann in through the door. She was still standing in the entryway, Willow. Baskets balanced against her hip when the rancher came in from the barn. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who have never had the luxury of softness, and he stopped in the doorway like he'd walked into a wall. His name, she would learn, was Elias Grant, and grief had done to him what it does to some men, not broken him outright, but hollowed him from the inside so that he still stood and still worked and still put food on the table. But something behind his eyes had gone dark and stayed dark. The way a house looks from the road at night when nobody's thought to light the lamp. He looked at Ruth Ann. He looked at the baskets. He looked, longest of all, at his daughter Sarah, standing in the doorway with the stranger, looking less exhausted than she had looked in longer than he could easily remember. "I make baskets," Ruth Ann said, because someone had to say something, and it was clear he would not be the one. "Sell them along the road. I don't mean to trouble your house." He was quiet long enough that she thought he meant to send her off the way. Half the houses on the road had sent her off that week with a shake of the head and a door closing soft or hard depending on how much shame the family carried about having nothing to give. Instead, he said, "How many you got left?" His voice came out rough, like something long unused. 11, she said. "I'll take all 11. Sarah's mouth actually fell open. The boy at the table looked up for the first time, suspicion written plain across his face, like a man who has learned that sudden kindness is usually the opening move of some larger disappointment. The little girl under the table went still as stone. Elias Grant did not explain himself, and Ruth Ann did not ask him to, because 11 baskets was more money than she had made in 3 weeks combined. And a woman learns not to question the tide when it finally decides to come in, what she did not expect, what none of them perhaps expected, least of all Elias himself, was for him to say, once the coins were counted into her palm and the baskets stacked along the wall like a strange new kind of furniture, "You'll stay for supper." Not a question. Almost an order, though there was something underneath it that was not command at all, but a kind of desperate, unpracticed hospitality. A man reaching for a rope he was not sure would hold. "I couldn't," Ruth Ann started, because that was the rule too. Never take more than the minimum, and a meal was more than 11 baskets had bought her. "You'll stay," Sarah said, quiet and fierce, "because I made enough for 6, and there's only 5 of us, and it'll go to waste otherwise, and Pa hates waste." She said it like a fact, laid gently on the counter, the same plain, unsentimental way. Ruth Ann herself might have said it, and something about hearing her own manner reflected back out of a 12-year-old's mouth made Ruth Ann's throat go tight in a way she was not prepared for. So she stayed. The baby's name was Nathaniel, and he would not settle no matter who held him, until Ruth Ann, without asking, the way you do not ask before catching a falling plate, lifted him from his basket and set him against her shoulder and began, without thinking, to hum the same low tune her own mother had hummed over her own babies. Years before there had been a house this quiet to fill. Nathaniel stopped crying inside of a minute. The whole table stared at her like she had performed a magic trick, though all she had done was hold the child the way children like to be held, firm and unbothered, no fear in the arms doing the holding. The angry boy, his name was Thomas, ate his supper without once looking at her, until his little sister, the one who had not said a word this whole time, reached across the table and set her chalk slate where Ruth Ann could see it. On it, in a careful wobbling hand, was drawn a basket, just that. A basket, badly drawn, but unmistakably a basket, and beneath it, smaller, the word home. "Lucy hasn't talked much," Sarah said, quiet, like an apology she'd made so many times it no longer cost her anything, "since Mama." Ruth Ann looked at the drawing a long moment. Then she said to the girl, and not to the room, "That's a fine basket, best one I've seen all week, and I've seen a lot of baskets, on account of making them." Lucy did not smile. But she did not look away either, and for a child who had gone months without speaking, that was its own kind of thunder. Elias watched all of this from the head of the table with his jaw set hard, and said almost nothing, and ate almost nothing, and when Ruth Ann finally rose to leave into the coming dark, he walked her as far as the porch and stood there with his hat in his hands, turning it, the way a man turns something he does not know what to do with. "Obliged to you," he said. He started to say something else, She would learn, in time, that this was his particular habit, starting a sentence and stopping just before the soft part of it, and then he did not finish it. He only nodded. Once, like a door closing gently instead of hard, and went back inside to his children. Ruth Ann walked the 3 miles home in the dark, with an empty basket sack and a full pocket, and she did not know yet that she would walk that road another 100 times before the year was through, but something in her chest, some old bruised place she had stopped checking on, had gone warm for the first time since the ground froze over her husband's grave, and she did not have a rule for that. She had never needed one before. She came back the following week, telling herself it was only business, that a man who bought 11 baskets outright might buy more, that a family with a coming winter and no woman in the house might have use for a dozen practical things a widow's hands could make. She told herself this the whole 3 miles, and she was still telling herself this when Sarah opened the door before she had even knocked. Having watched for her, it was plain from the window. The house was different in small ways. Someone had swept the porch. The fire in the hearth had been banked properly instead of left to gutter and choke on its own ash. And Thomas, the angry boy, was the one tending it, though he still would not look at her directly, still held his shoulders like a fortress expecting siege. Lucy sat under the table again, but this time she had brought her slate up onto the tabletop itself, a small migration that Sarah noted with the same startled pride a mother notes a first step. Nathaniel, in his basket, was not crying. He was, in fact, nearly asleep, worn out from whatever peace had settled over the house since last week, the way a household's temperature rises and falls with whatever wind has last blown through its door. Ruth Ann set to work almost without thinking about it, mending a torn hem on Sarah's dress while the girl cooked, because her hands had never learned how to sit idle in a room that needed something done, and doing was easier. Then talking and talking, she was learning, was not a thing this house did easily or well. "You don't have to do that," Sarah said, though she did not stop Ruth Ann's needle. "I know I don't have to," Ruth Ann said. "I'm doing it because it needs doing, and because I like a job I can finish in an afternoon, seeing as most of my jobs don't finish so easy." Sarah laughed at that, a short, surprised laugh, like she'd forgotten the shape of her own laughing and was relieved to find it still fit, and something in the kitchen loosened another 1/2 inch. It became, without either of them naming it as such, a kind of arrangement. Ruth Ann came twice a week, sometimes 3 times, always with a reason ready, a mended dress, an extra basket, a jar of preserves she'd traded for in town and had more of than she needed. Reasons that were true enough on their surface and thin enough underneath that Elias, she suspected, saw straight through every one of them and let her keep them anyway, out of some deep unspoken gratitude. Neither of them had the words to spend on. He was not a man who spoke his thanks. He showed it instead in the small provisions he left where she would find them. A jug of fresh milk on the porch step, a length of good calico cloth folded over the porch rail like it had simply appeared there, firewood split smaller than the pieces he split for his own hearth, because he had noticed, without saying so, that her hands were smaller than his and struggled with the larger logs. It was Lucy who broke first, in the way that quiet children sometimes do, all at once instead of by degrees. Ruth Ann had been teaching her to weave, small, simple things, a coaster of rushes, nothing that required strength, only patience. And the girl's fingers had gone still over the half-finished coaster, and she had looked up and said, in a voice gone unused so long it cracked in the middle like a hinge that needed oil, "Mama used to sing." The whole kitchen stopped. Sarah's spoon paused mid-stir. Thomas at the hearth went rigid. Elias, who had just come in from the yard and stood frozen in the doorway with an armful of wood, did not move at all, did not breathe, it seemed, for the length of that sentence. "Did she?" Ruth Ann said. Gentle, unhurried, the way you'd approach a bird that had finally decided to land close enough to touch. "What did she sing?" Lucy's small face crumpled, not with the storm of a full cry, but with the trembling edge of one held just barely at bay. "I don't remember," she whispered. And that, it turned out, was the wound underneath everything. Not the singing itself, but the terror of forgetting it, the 6-year-old horror of losing the last true thing she had of her mother, one hummed note at a time, until nothing remained but a hole shaped like a song. I try to remember and it goes further away. Ruth Ann did not tell her it would be all right. She had a rule against saying things she did not know to be true. Instead, she said, "Then we'll ask your pa. He'll remember." Fathers remember the songs even when they forget they remember them. And she looked deliberately at Elias, still frozen in the doorway with his armful of wood, and something passed between them that was not quite a request and not quite a command, but landed somewhere in between, in the place where two grieving people learn to lean on each other without either one admitting the leaning. He set the wood down. He came and knelt by his daughter's chair, an enormous man folding himself down to the height of a 6-year-old, and he began, low and rough and terribly out of practice, to hum. It took him 3 tries to find the tune. When he found it, Lucy's whole body went slack with relief. The held breath of months finally let go, and she leaned into her father's shoulder and hummed along, badly, brokenly, and did not stop until Sarah and even Thomas had drifted close enough to hum it too. A whole family relearning a song together in a kitchen gone soft with lamplight, while Ruth Ann sat very still at the table with a half-finished coaster in her lap and did not let herself cry because she had a rule. But it was, that evening, the hardest that rule had ever been to keep. She did not know, that evening, that Eugenia Pruitt had already begun asking questions about her in town, who she was, where she'd come from, why a respectable widow was seen walking the Grant Road so many times a week, what exactly a woman with no husband and no family thought she was doing, alone, in a house with a widower and his children, and whether the town oughtn't to have something to say about it before matters went further than decent people could pretend not to notice. The whispering did not reach Ruth Ann all at once. It came the way weather comes, a change in the pressure long before the storm itself arrives, a look held a beat too long at the mercantile, a conversation that stopped clean when she stepped into the general store, a Sunday morning where 3 women who had once nodded her a polite good morning now found urgent business with their hymnals instead. She noticed. She had a rule against remarking on things that could not be changed by remarking, so she said nothing and kept her back straight and bought her flour and her thread and walked out with her chin level, though something cold had settled behind her ribs that had not been there the week before. Eugenia Pruitt was the kind of woman the whole valley had learned over the years to speak carefully around, not because she held any office or any deed, but because she held something more dangerous in a small town, which was opinion, freely dispensed and endlessly repeated. She was the banker's sister-in-law, which gave her a foot in every door that mattered, and she had never once in living memory been heard to say an unkind word about anyone in a way that could be called unkind outright, only worried, only troubled, only hoping, for the sake of decency, that certain matters might be looked into. She had decided somewhere in the space of 2 Sundays that Ruth Ann Coldwell was a matter that wanted looking into, and she set about the looking with the patient, relentless industry of a woman who had never in her life had to build anything with her own hands, and so had turned all her considerable energy toward the tearing down of other people's. "I only think of the children," she told the sewing circle, needle moving placid and precise. "A woman coming and going like that, no ring on her hand, no family to ute for her character. I only wonder what's really being provided for, out there. I only wonder if Mr. Grant has thought it through, in his grief, the way a clearer head might." It reached Elias before it reached Ruth Ann, in its full shape, carried to him second-hand by a neighbor who thought he ought to know what was being said. And he came to find her on the road one gray afternoon, with his jaw set in that hard way she was coming to recognize as the shape his hurt took when it had nowhere else to go. "You've heard what's being said," he said. It was not a question. "I've heard enough," Ruth Ann said. "I don't care what they say. I know you don't. But I have to live in this valley same as you, and a woman's reputation is the only currency some folks will ever let her keep, so I'd be lying if I said it cost me nothing." She looked at him steady. "I won't stop coming because of talk, but I won't have your children paying for my company either." "If it comes to that," Elias was quiet a long moment, turning his hat, starting a sentence, "I could," and stopping it, the way he always did, right at the vulnerable edge. Ruth Ann, who had grown tired, in the week since, of watching him do this, finally said it for him. "You could what, Elias? Finish it. You start 100 sentences and finish none of them, and I've about had my fill of guessing the ends." He looked at her like she'd struck him, and then, slowly, like something loosening after a long freeze, he said, "I could tell them to go to hell." A short, startled laugh broke out of her before she could stop it, the first laugh she'd allowed herself in longer than she could easily count, and something in his face eased at the sound of it, like he'd been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for the chance to make her laugh. But talk, once loosed, does not simply return to its cage because two people have decided to laugh in its face, and the trouble Eugenia Pruitt had planted found fertile ground soon enough, because trouble rarely travels alone. The second blow came not from gossip, but from the bank, in the shape of a letter delivered to the Grant Ranch by a boy on a borrowed horse, informing Elias Grant that the note held against his land by Silas Vance was due in full within 60 days on account of certain irregularities discovered in the terms, and that failure to satisfy the debt would result in the bank's exercise of its right to foreclose upon the property in its entirety. Elias read the letter twice at the kitchen table with his children watching from the doorway, not understanding the words, but understanding, in the way children always understand, that something in the room had gone wrong. When Ruth Ann arrived that afternoon with a fresh basket balanced on her hip, she found him sitting exactly where he'd been an hour before, the letter flat on the table before him, his big hands pressed flat on either side of it, like he was holding the table down instead of the other way around. Elias. He did not look up. 60 days, he said. 60 days, or we lose the land my father cleared with his own hands, the land my wife is buried on, the only ground these children have ever called home." His voice did not rise. It went instead very quiet, very flat, the voice of a man who has run out of ordinary words for the size of what he's facing. "I don't have it. I've never had it. Not since the fever took the herd 2 winters back, and Vance knows it. And Vance has wanted this land since before my father died, and now he's found his excuse." Ruth Ann set the basket down slowly. She thought of Sarah's tired shoulders, of Thomas's crossed arms, of Lucy's slate with its careful drawing of a basket and the word home beneath it, of Nathaniel, finally sleeping through a whole night without crying. She thought of everything. This house had only just begun to become, and she felt something harden in her that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the particular fury of a woman who has already buried one home and refuses, with everything left in her, to watch another one taken. "Then we have 60 days, she said, "to make sure he doesn't get it." The storm came on the 41st day, and it came the way the worst storms always do, without enough warning. A sky that had looked merely gray at noon, gone black and roaring by 4, wind coming down off the ridge with a sound like something tearing, and rain behind it hard enough to flatten the garden Sarah had worked all summer to keep. Ruth Ann had come that morning to help with the mending and stayed, because the sky told her plainly she'd be a fool to start the walk home. And it was as well she did, because it was near 6 o'clock with the wind screaming and the lamp guttering in its glass, that Thomas came tearing in from the barn, soaked through and white-faced, shouting that the hay was on fire. Lightning, they would work out later, had struck the old dry loft, and the wind that had driven the storm in was the same wind, now driving the fire sideways through the barn faster than any bucket line could hope to answer. Elias was out the door before the sentence was fully spoken, and Ruth Ann was one step behind him, shouting back over her shoulder for Sarah to keep the little ones inside no matter what. no matter what they heard. And then she was out in the rain and the roar with buckets in her hands, same as Elias, because 2 horses and a milk cow stood trapped behind a wall of climbing flame, and neither one of them was built to stand by while something burned. It was the longest 20 minutes of Ruth Ann's life, worse in its way than the day she had buried her husband, because grief, at least, moves slow enough to be born, and this moved fast, all flame and smoke and animals screaming, and Elias shouting her name through the roar to tell her which way to go, which post might hold and which might not. And at one point a beam came down not 4 feet from where she stood, and she felt the heat of it against her face like a hand slapped hard, and did not stop, because stopping was not a thing this night would forgive. They got the horses out. They got the cow out. Whist. The barn itself they could not save, not fully, though the rain that had brought the fire was, in the end, the same rain that killed it, coming down at last in sheets heavy enough to drown what the wind had lit, so that by the time the worst of it had passed, what remained of the barn was a smoking, ruined skeleton. But the house stood, and the animals stood, and Elias and Ruth Ann stood in the mud. In the last dying light of the fire, both of them soaked to the bone and blackened with smoke, staring at the wreckage of one more thing that had been taken from him. "I'm sorry," Ruth Ann said, because there was nothing else true enough to say. Elias did not answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice had gone to a place she had not heard it go before, cracked clean through whatever wall he usually kept behind it. "I keep losing things," he said. "I lost my wife. I'm about to lose my land. Tonight I nearly lost my barn and my stock both. And the only reason I didn't lose more besides is because you were standing next to me, instead of 3 miles down the road where you'd have had every right to be." He turned to look at her, rain running off the brim of his hat, off his jaw, and he started a sentence. "I don't know what I'd dad." And this time, for the first time, he did not stop it. "I don't know what I'd do if you stopped coming," he said. "I've thought on it. I don't have an answer I like." Ruth Ann stood very still in the mud and the smoke and the dying rain, and she did not have a rule ready for this, the rule about crying, because something in her chest had already gone past the point where rules could hold it. And so, for the first time since she had buried her husband with her own 2 hands in frozen ground 3 years before, Ruth Ann Coldwell cried in front of another living soul, standing in the ruin of a barn that had nearly taken everything. And Elias Grant, who did not have many words but had, it turned out, exactly the right amount for this, did not say a single one. He only stepped closer and put his arms around her, careful, like she was something that might break if held too rough, and held on until the shaking stopped. It was 2 nights later on the porch, with the children long abed and the smell of smoke still faint on the wind from the ruined barn, that Ruth Ann told him the rest of it. The part of her grief she had not yet given to anyone, not even to Sarah in their long kitchen afternoons, not even to herself, most days if she could help it. She told them about the baby. "Daniel and I had a girl," she said, into the dark, her hands wrapped around a cup gone cold an hour before the fever took him. She came early, in the coldest part of that same winter, and she was so small, Elias, smaller than anything I'd ever held, and she only breathed for 2 days. She said it plain, the way she said everything, a fact laid gently on the counter, though her voice caught. Once hard, in the middle of it. "I buried her before I buried him. I never told the town. Folks assume a young widow's only grief is her husband, and I let them assume it, because it was easier than explaining twice, and because," her voice went very quiet here, "because I had a rule after. Never ask for more than the minimum. I told myself I'd already asked the world for a husband and a child and a home, and it had given me none of the 3 in the end, so I'd stop asking. I'd just make baskets and walk the road and take only what was offered and never again reach for more than that." Elias was silent a long while. Then he said, low, "That's a hard rule to live inside of." "It's kept me standing 3 years," Ruth Ann said. "Standing's not the same as living," he said, and it was the truest thing anyone had said to her since the funeral, and she felt it land somewhere deep and old, a small crack opening in a wall she had built with her own 2 hands and had, until that moment, been rather proud of. "I've got my own rule," Elias went on. "Never finish the sentence that cost the most. Start it, let it hang. Never say the last part out loud, because the last part is always the part that could break you if it's not returned." He turned to look at her in the dark, his face barely visible by the last coal of lamplight through the window glass. "I'd like to try finishing one, if you'll let me." "Try it," Ruth Ann said, her heart going strange and fast in her chest. "I love you," Elias Grant said, plain as anything, no hedging in it at all, the words falling into the night like a stone into still water. "I've loved you since you stood in my doorway with 11 baskets and told my daughter you'd sell to whoever answered the door. I didn't let myself think it plain until the barn burned, because a burning barn has a way of clearing a man's head about what actually matters to him. I love you, and I'd like you to stay. Not for an afternoon, not twice a week. I mean, stay, Ruth Ann. I mean, this is home, if you'll have it." She did not answer with words at first. She reached over, in the dark, and took his hand. The same hand that had held buckets against the fire, that had split firewood smaller so her hands would not struggle, and she held it the way you hold the one true thing you have finally, after everything, allowed yourself to reach for. "I'll have it," she said. "I'll have all of it." And upstairs, unseen by either of them, Sarah stood at the top of the stairs where she had crept down to fetch water and had stayed instead, listening. And she went back to bed with the first whole unworried sleep she'd had since her mother died, because some part of her, the part that had aged 10 years in the space of one winter, finally understood that the house was not going to fall down around her after all. But 60 days is 60 days, no matter how much a man's heart has healed inside them, and the 58th day arrived with Silas Vance himself riding up the Grant Road in a good black coat, flanked by 2 men from the bank, to inform Elias, with the particular relish of a man who has waited a long time for a thing and can finally taste it, that the note was due in 48 hours, and that he, Vance, would be at the courthouse steps at 9 o'clock on the appointed morning to record the transfer of the deed should payment not be forthcoming, and that he had, out of what he called Christian charity, already arranged for a party of interested buyers to view the property that very afternoon. Word of it moved through the valley faster than the fire had moved through the barn, and it moved, as such things do, straight into the ear of Eugenia Pruitt, who found in it a fresh vein of the very concern she had been mining for weeks. "It only proves what I've said all along," she told anyone who would listen, at the Mercantile, after church, over the fence rows. "A man in that much trouble taking up with a stranger nobody in this valley can euch for. Is it any wonder the Lord's seen fit to bring the reckoning due? I only hope, for the children's sake, that matters are settled before things go from bad to worse." She said it with her particular gift for sounding sorrowful about a thing she was in fact delighted to discuss, and half the valley, uncertain and easily led, began to nod along, the way crowds do when someone speaks with enough confidence to borrow against. Ruth Ann heard the whole of it standing in the general store on the 59th day, buying thread she did not especially need, because she could not make herself stay home and wait. And she heard Eugenia Pruitt's voice carrying from behind the flour barrels, clear and pleased with itself, saying that no decent woman ought to have attached herself to a man so plainly headed for ruin. Unless, of course, ruin was precisely what such a woman was after, a foothold, a claim staked before the wreckage. And wasn't that its own kind of scandal? Ruth Ann set down her thread. She walked around the flour barrels, and she stood in front of Eugenia Pruitt in the middle of the general store with every eye in the place, suddenly and desperately interested in the floor. And she said, in the plain, unhurried, fact-laid-on-the-counter voice that was the only voice she had ever known how to use, "You've spent a good deal of breath on my character these last weeks, Mrs. Pruitt, so I'll spend a little of mine on yours. I came to that man's door selling baskets because I was hungry, Same as any of us have been hungry at one time or another, though maybe you've forgotten what that feels like. I stayed because his children needed tending and his house needed warming, and because, as it turns out, I love him plain and simple, the way I'd have thought a church-going woman might recognize as a decent enough reason for anything. If you'd like to keep talking about me, you go right ahead. I've got a wagon to fix and a debt to help pay, and I haven't got the time today to stand here and be your morning's entertainment. And she picked up her thread and paid for it and walked out, leaving a silence behind her thick enough to cut. And it was into that silence that old Mrs. Halloway, who had kept house for the Pruitts for 11 years, and had never once in all that time been heard to contradict her employer, finally spoke up from the back of the store. "I'll say what I've held my tongue on long enough," she said, loud enough to carry. "I've cooked and cleaned in that woman's house for 11 years, and I have watched her make a sport of other folks' misfortune the whole while, dressed up so pretty and concerned that half this valley's mistook it for kindness. That widow's done more real good for the Grant children in 2 months than this town's done in 2 years of watching them suffer and calling it none of our business. I don't care what it cost me. I quit Mrs. and Wanatan Pruitt, and I'll be glad to spend my Sundays somewhere the gossip's a little thinner." The store erupted into the particular hush that follows a thing everyone has wanted to see happen for years, finally happening in front of them. And Eugenia Pruitt, for the first time in living memory, found herself with nothing at all to say. That left, still, the matter of the note, and 48 hours does not stretch itself for anyone's convenience, however satisfying the morning's reckonings. Elias sat at his kitchen table that night with his ledger spread before him and came up, again and again short of what was owed, no matter how he turned the numbers, and Ruth Ann sat across from him with her own small store of coin laid out on the table between them, every dollar she had saved from every basket she had ever sold, minimum taking thrift, and it was not enough either. Not nearly, though she pushed it toward him anyway, because a rule about never asking for more than the minimum had never once said anything about refusing to give more than the minimum when it was needed. It was Sarah who thought of it first, in the end, standing in the doorway in her nightgown when she ought to have been long asleep. "The baskets," she said. "Ruth Ann's baskets are all over this valley by now. Half the houses on this road have got one on their porch or their table. Everybody knows her work. What if we asked them? Not for charity, for a fair trade. What if you wove enough baskets between now and the courthouse, and Pa sold every head of stock he could spare besides, and between the two, it added up. It was a child's plan, simple and stubborn in the way children's plans often are, built more on faith than arithmetic. But Ruth Ann looked at the girl standing in the doorway, a girl who had learned to run a household at 12 and had, in the space of 2 months, learned also to hope again. And she said, "Get me every scrap of willow in this county. Sarah Grant, we've got 48 hours and I've got 2 good hands." She did not sleep that night, or the one after. Word went out through the valley, not from Ruth Ann, who was too busy weaving to spread it herself, but from Sarah and from old Mrs. Seven Halloway, newly unemployed and newly delighted to have somewhere useful to spend her outrage, and from a dozen neighbors who had quietly, in the weeks since the fire, come to admire the widow who'd stood in the rain with buckets same as any man, and by the morning of the 60th day, the porch of the Grant Ranch was piled with baskets bought outright at fair prices by half the valley. Families who wanted, in their own way, to answer Eugenia Pruitt's gossip with the plainest rebuttal available to them, which was their money and their trust, freely given. They rode to the courthouse together, Elias and Ruth Ann, with the whole sum counted twice and wrapped tight in a strong box between them. And Silas Vance stood on the steps in his good black coat, with a smile already halfway arranged for the announcement of his victory, and it fell clean off his face when Elias set the strong box down before him and said, "Count it. It's all there, every dollar owed, and not one more, seeing as I don't believe in giving a man more than he's due, however little he deserves it." Vance counted it, twice, with his jaw going tighter each time, and found, to his evident and public disgust, that it was indeed every dollar owed, and he had no choice, before a small crowd that had gathered on the steps specifically to watch him have no choice but to sign the notes satisfied and hand back the deed. Who had come to watch what she'd expected to be a fitting punishment for a family she decided did not deserve their own land, stood at the edge of the crowd and found nothing at all to say for the second time in 1 week, which was, by any measure, a personal record. The wedding came in the spring, on the porch, where he had first finished a sentence he meant, under a sky gone the particular blue that only comes after a hard winter has finally truly broken. It was small because neither of them had much taste for spectacle, but the whole valley came anyway, filling the yard where the old barn had stood, now rebuilt, red-painted, better than before. Sarah stood beside Ruth Ann, in a new dress she had helped sew herself, no longer looking quite so much like a woman wearing a child's face. Thomas, no longer angry, or angry in a smaller, more ordinary way now, the way boys are allowed to be angry about small things instead of the whole shape of the world, stood at his father's side and did not cross his arms even once. Lucy sang, actually sang, out loud in front of the whole gathered valley, the very song her father had relearned for her one evening in a lamplit kitchen, and her voice cracked in places and did not care, and Elias, standing at the altar built of nothing but planed porch wood, had to look hard at the sky to keep his own composure. Nathaniel, walking now, toddled the length of the aisle twice before anyone thought to catch him, to general and enormous delight. Ruth Ann carried, instead of flowers, a basket, small, plain, the very first one she had ever woven as a girl at her grandmother's knee, kept all these years through every hardship, because some things a person cannot bring themselves to sell, no matter how thin the winter runs, and inside it, tucked among the willow, sat a small carved wooden bird, whittled that winter by Elias's own rough hands in the evenings after the children were down, a thing he had made without telling her why, only that his fingers had wanted after so long doing nothing but work and grief, to make something small and whole and given freely. He placed it in her palm at the end of the vows, and said, this time in front of the whole valley, the sentence he had spent so many months learning to finish. Stay, he said. You're not going anywhere. This is home. Years later, when the children were grown, when Sarah had a house and children of her own 2 towns over and still, every autumn, wove a basket for the Christmas table, because some hands never forget what they were taught. When Thomas ran the ranch alongside his father with the same steady, unhurried competence, his old anger worn down at last into ordinary patience, when Lucy sang in the church choir every Sunday in a voice the whole valley had watched come back to her, note by note, in a lamplit kitchen, nobody but the family fully remembered anymore, when Nathaniel, grown tall and easy in the way of children raised inside enough love to spare, told the story himself sometimes to his own children, though he had been too small to remember any of it firsthand and had it only second-hand, the way all the best family stories are eventually carried forward. The old-timers of the valley, sitting on porches of their own in the long gold evenings, still told it the way it had first been told to them. Of the widow who came selling baskets to a house gone quiet with grief, and the rancher who bought everyone and set a feast, and how a home is never really lost so long as somebody is willing to knock on the door twice and somebody else is willing at last to finish the sentence and let them in. It was never really about the baskets, the old-timers would say, settling back in their chairs as the light went long and amber across the valley. It never is. It's about who answers the door and what they're brave enough to offer once it's open, and whether 2 broken, careful people can learn, together, slowly, one finished sentence at a time, to call the same small patch of ground home.